Well, Esther, the 5th chapter here on session number 6 is where we come tonight. And tonight, as I promised, I think last week, we're going to begin to cover a little bit more territory as we come through 10 chapters. And so we'll have 8, 9, and 10 after this, which probably is going to be 2 more sessions, but that's a little bit of a prediction. But I want us to look at much of what is the heart of the foundation of the story anyway, in leading up through. And we're going to see that Esther has a banquet. You may remember last time when we left off that Esther was given word by Mordecai, her uncle, saying, hey, it's such a time as this, perhaps God has put you in the palace, and you need to go before the king. And she said, but if I go before the king, he hasn't called me, he's got the right to kill me. And Mordecai said, well, you're going to die anyway, you just as well go now. And if you fail in this regard, God will raise up someone else, but maybe you are the one for such a time as this. Just a reminder of the perspective I'm coming from the book of Esther, is that the book of Esther is a revelation of how God deals with his chosen nation when they are out of the land and out of fellowship with him, which really would be today, because the nation of Israel, though they are moving back to the land, they still are out of fellowship with him, and in many ways they're not living with the temple and the theocracy that they're supposed to have. So the way God is dealing with Israel today, I think, is much the same as he dealt with Israel in the book of Esther. And that is that you don't really see him. Only with spiritual eyes can you see God in the book of Esther. And that is, you see him behind the scenes. You see what we call providence. And providence is just I usually call it the invisible hand of God. You know it's there. You know he was working behind it. And anyone who believes there is a God and believes that he loves the nation of Israel can see his hand working in here. But it's not on the surface at all. It doesn't just say, and God intervened in the heart of Ahasuerus, whose name I never can say, and brought about, this great victory for the Jewish people. It's not on the surface like that. It's underneath the surface. So let's just see how underneath the surface it is as we continue on in chapter 5, verse 1. It says, it came to pass on the 3rd day that Esther put on her royal apparel and stood in the inner court of the king's house over against the king's house, and the king sat on his royal throne in the royal house over against the gate of the house. That's an awful lot of detail, isn't it? Just an interesting side note, you'll see later on, too, that this may come about, that there has been in about 50 years ago anyway, I started to say in recent years, but a while back, before the Middle East was quite as difficult to work in as it is today, there was a lot of archaeological evidence that was done in Persia, in Susa, Shushan, as it's often called here, and they actually discovered this palace that we believe this palace is anyway. And they went through and they discovered, everything here that is talking about where it says over against the king's house, there's the inner court over against, that means, leading up to, opposite of, and all of the details that you see in here anyway were verified, giving some historical validity to the book of Esther. But it came about on the 3rd day. I read actually a Jewish writer today who would reject Christianity and also rejects verbal plenary inspiration and a lot of things like that. But he had a commentary on the book of Esther, and I happened to read it, and he said there's something about the 3rd day in the Hebrew Scriptures that we can't quite figure out. And I thought, well, yeah, as God is just over and over again, on the 3rd day, he brings about this new life, if you will, this resurrection that comes about. So here, what is going to happen here on the 3rd day is going to be something that ultimately is going to lead to the salvation of the Jewish people. They're not going to be saved this day, but it's going to lead to. Now, on the 3rd day of what? If you're looking in the context here, it's the 3rd day of something, right? It's not not the third day of the week necessarily, but it's the third day of fasting. That's right. And just a few verses before, where is that? In verse 16, says, neither eat nor drink 3 days, night or day. 3 days, night or day. Now, you know, of course, that a Hebrew day begins when? Sundown, that's right. So for the Hebrew, the order of a day is the dark part of the day first, followed by the light part of the day. You see this all the way back to the book of Genesis and creation, where it says evening and morning, and that was the day. Put those two, put the dark part and the light part, and that's the whole thing. So here it is Wednesday night, but for a Jewish thinking, it would be now Thursday, and we do that just differently because to us it's Wednesday night. Last night was Tuesday night. Now. In the scripture, of course, it starts at sundown. So they had night 1, day 1, night 2, day 2, night 3, day 3. And this is during that day 3, the people are still fasting. They're completing their fast this day. And she put on her royal apparel, and she stood in the inner court of the king's house. She didn't just march right in, but she stood out. I think, I'm picturing this a little bit, but I think she stood there somewhat nonchalant, probably as nervous as she had ever been in her life, thinking, I hope he sees me and says, what do you want? It was somewhat planned that this would be, but she didn't just march in. So it says in verse 2, and so when the king saw Esther the queen standing in the court, that she obtained favor in his sight. And the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. So Esther drew near and touched the top of the scepter. In chapter 4 again, the description of the protocol is there about if you just march in and the king doesn't put out his scepter, then they're going to take you away. So here he obtained favor in his sight. That word obtain favor is used later on in the passage, and it is verse 11 where it says that Haman told of the glory of his riches and the multitude of the children and all the things that the king had promoted him and how he had advanced him above the princes and the servants. Now, that word advanced him in verse 11 is actually the same word as obtained favor. So the king thinks well of Haman later on in the chapter, and he thinks well of Esther here. He advanced her. She obtained favor in his sight, and so now she is together with the king. But something interesting is going to happen. She is not just going to come right out and say, let me tell you what I need. Haman's going to kill us all. The edict has gone out. Can you do something to undo this edict that you have given? She doesn't come right out. Verse 3, then said the king unto her, what wilt thou, Queen Esther, and what is thy request? It shall be even given thee to half the kingdom. Now, don't you have to ask here, and I think you do, but the bottom line is, before we ask the question is, I don't have the answer. If he is so favorable to her right here, what do you want? I'll give you up to half the kingdom. And yet she doesn't ask the question. I would be thinking, if he strike while the iron's hot, that's what I'd be thinking. He's offered, he's got his checkbook out, go ahead and do it. But she doesn't do that. And maybe anything really is speculation on why didn't she do it. But maybe she wanted to make sure that Haman got caught up in this thing as well. And Haman's not there right now. And she needs to wait and maneuver all of this around. Now, in that Jewish commentary I told you that I was reading, the author there says that he read 24 different explanations as to why she didn't ask here. So my hunch is, you can make up whatever you want why she didn't ask. All we know, again, really is she didn't ask. But here's this nice nice little gesture, you can have up to half the kingdom. We think, this again could be wrong as well, but we think that that is a figure of speech. You can have half the kingdom. And it's a figure of speech that means up to half of the income that comes into the kingdom in a given year. That's how far I'm willing to go in the check that I will write you. Whatever it is, it's very much a generous offer, isn't it? Does anybody remember anywhere else where someone was offered up to half the kingdom? Let me give you a hint. Somebody ended up losing his head. Exactly. So King Herod told his wife, whatever you want, up to half the kingdom. And she said, I want the head of John the Baptist on a platter. And that is how he lost his life. Now, there is, those are the two times in the Bible you see this offer of up to half the kingdom. There are a number of times you see it in old Jewish histories like Herodotus and some of those extra biblical materials, that it seems that this is, it's a figure of speech in some sense that says, I'm willing to give you just about whatever you want. You got a blank check. What do you need? I'm here for you. And this is it. So she has this offer, but in verse 4, it says, Esther answered, if it seem good unto the king, let the king and Haman come this day into a banquet that I have prepared for him. Now notice now she has Haman invited, and she's already prepared the banquet. This is a banquet today, and I don't know about you, but even if I'm the queen, I think that it's a banquet for the king is something that you prepare in advance for. So she knew she wasn't going to ask right then, but she was going to invite him and his most favored associate, Haman, to come into a banquet. Verse 5, the king said, cause Haman to make haste, that he may do as Esther hath said. So the king and Haman came to the banquet that Esther had prepared. And the king said to Esther at the banquet of wine, what is thy petition? It shall be granted unto thee. And what is thy request? Even to half the kingdom it shall be performed. Now, just notice that the king here is not totally in the dark. He's a little bit in the dark, but he's not totally in the dark. He knows that this is not just a birthday banquet or a nice feast that she wants to put on, but that she wants something. He's been married long enough to know this. So what is it you want? And I'm willing to give you what you want. So just bring it out. Well, once again, Esther hesitates. In verse 7, then answered Esther and said, my petition and my request is, if I found favor in the sight of the king, and if it please the king to grant my petition to perform my request, let the king and Haman come to the banquet that I shall prepare for them, and I will do tomorrow as the king hath said. Well, why are we dragging this out? Again, I don't know why we're dragging it out. I can find somebody who gives you 24 reasons, and you can make up your 25th reason, but all we know, again, is she is dragging this out, and she has now another banquet. So, in verse 9, then went Haman forth that day, joyful and with a glad heart. Have you ever gotten happy too soon? This is definitely a case of getting happy too soon. And as a pastor, I'll give a little illustration that I've often shared with other pastors. I don't know if it's an illustration or a bit of advice I always give them. And that is, if a pastor calls me, as they often do, and they'll say something like, I'm just really down. It's usually Mondays. That's when pastors call other pastors. It's, oh boy, I'm really down. I mean, we were low yesterday. We didn't have anybody. The offering was bad, and I don't know what's going to happen. I don't even know if I can stay here. I don't know if this place is going to work. And I always say, now wait a minute. Don't judge your ministry based upon one Sunday. That's too short. But then sometimes you get others, and they call and say, boy, Yesterday was fantastic. We had to set up extra chairs. The offering was out the roof. They sang He's a Jolly Good Fellow before we left, and it was wonderful. I said, don't judge your ministry on one Sunday. Whether it's really wonderful or it's really the pits, you got to take a very long look at it here. Now, Haman here, he comes from this banquet and says, hey, the queen wants to have me tomorrow, and the king as well. It's just the two of us, and here it is. I'm pretty convinced that if you got an invitation to go and visit the Queen of England and her husband was going to be there and it was going to be the three of you, you would count that a great privilege and honor, wouldn't you? And so here he comes, very glad in heart, and when Haman, in the middle of verse 9, when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he stood not up, nor moved for him, he was full of indignation against Mordecai. Now, he's happy until here comes Mordecai again, or there's Mordecai in his path, actually in this case. And Mordecai does what he's been doing, so it's really no surprise, but just ruins the fun that Haman is having. And he is now full of indignation against Mordecai. In verse 10, nevertheless, Haman refrained himself. And when he came home, he sent and called for his friends and Zeresh, his wife. This is the first time we see her mentioned by name. And Haman told them of the glory of his riches and the multitude of his children and all things wherein the king had promoted him and how he had advanced him among the princes and the servants of the king. Do you have any friends like this? Call you together to tell you how wonderful they are? And must have been just quite an awkward meeting. But here he is bragging on himself. And yet, all of that's just an introduction. In verse 12, Haman said, moreover, yea, Esther the queen did let no man come in to the king unto the banquet that she had prepared, but myself, and tomorrow I'm invited also with her with the king. Yet all this availeth me nothing, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting in the king's gate. He's obviously quite upset. And all of the glory and the riches and the honor that he's got mean nothing to him as long as he can't have that. There's a story in the Bible that I'm reminded of as I think of this story because there's some similarities. And let's see, anybody remember King Ahab as the old preacher whose name I just forgot, from Memphis, Tennessee, R.G. Lee. The old preacher R.G. Lee used to call Ahab the old toad that squatted on the throne. Toad, excuse me, I can't even talk. The old toad that squatted on the throne. Well, he was the old toad that squatted on the throne. And then he would describe his wife, whose name was Jezebel, the viper coiled up beside the throne. So you got the toad and the viper. And Ahab, of course, had all the kingdom, and yet, does anybody remember what he wanted? Ahab, yeah, exactly. He wanted Naboth's vineyard. You may remember, little vineyard that this poor guy had. And he wanted that vineyard, and Naboth wouldn't sell him the vineyard because Naboth was living according to the law, and the law said I can't sell it outside of my family. It has to stay in the family. Ahab just pouted on the throne. Basically, is what happened. And go sometime and listen. You can find it on YouTube. Just search R.G. Lee, and the sermon is called Payday Someday. And with very picturesque language, he will talk about that story there. But here, this guy is sort of that old toad squatting on the throne, pouting because he can't have Naboth's vineyard. In this case, pouting because there's this one Jew named Mordecai who won't bow down to him. And so everything has come to naught. Who cares what I've got if this guy is not going to bow down to me? Now, here it says, and I see Mordecai the Jew sitting in the king's gate. Here, Mordecai, in the last chapter, he had revealed his Judaism. And I think what we begin to see here is that the hatred that Haman has really is just anti-Semitism. There's he hates his Jewishness. that is involved here, but certainly hates Mordecai. Verse 14, then said Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends unto him, let a gallows be made of 50 cubits height, and tomorrow speak thou unto the king, that Mordecai may be hanged thereon. Then go thou in merrily with the king unto the banquet. And the thing pleased Haman, and he caused the gallows to be made. This would make a great movie, wouldn't it? As you got two trains going down the track, and there's about to be a collision. And Esther on one train is about to save Mordecai and all his people and her people. And Haman on the other train wants to kill Mordecai and all his people. So they're working against each other here. And they both think, tomorrow's going to be a great day. The word gallows, by the way, it actually is just the Hebrew word for tree. And obviously, if you're going to build a tree 50 cubits high, it probably, we might use the word stake. And we consider it, hanging. We think gallows and hanging, the Old West kind of put a rope and around their neck. And that could have been it. But it's actually not all that unsimilar, if that's a word, to even some of the language in the book of Acts where it talks about Jesus was hanged upon a tree, and using that same Hebrew thought. So whether he was hanged there as in tied up until he died, or hanged there like a hangman's noose, or whatever happened, this is the what is being built here. So gallows is a word that really is by interpretation more than anything else. That here's something that you're going to hang a guy on in some manner, whether you tie him up or nail him up or rope him up or whatever you're going to do to him. He's 50 cubits. A cubit is about, let's say, 18 inches, and that's 35 feet. I'm going to trust your math on that. It is high.
It's higher than 50 feet. No, like 75.
It's a tall one. There is, I would just add just as a footnote, we use 18 inches as a sort of a standard definition of a cubit, but there's actually, in history as you go back, there's a pretty wide span of what a cubit is. And I believe, and pardon me for not digging down into this, I believe that there's actually a different Hebrew word that's used here that, again, cubit was a little bit of an interpretation. So I'm not sure we know exactly how tall that is, but tall enough to hang a man anyway, let's say that.
High enough for everybody to be seen.
It's a good point. Wanted it high enough to everybody to be seen. He wants to make a spectacle out of what is happening here, I'll start to get into something political. I'll just move on. But lest I not finish tonight. Well, now, speaking of behind the scenes God doing something, chapter 6, verse 1, it says, on that night could not the king sleep. And he commanded to bring the book of the records of the Chronicles, that they be read before the king. I guess the book of the records of the Chronicles were so boring that he thought it would probably put him to sleep if somebody would come and read that to him. And so when I can't sleep, I turn on PBS, and it rocks me to sleep just immediately. But here, the king can't sleep. Who knows again why he can't sleep, but to me that's just a little bit of good news that it's not just the poor people, not just the middle class, whatever. It's even the king sometimes has a night that he can't sleep, and whether something was troubling him or he had too much coffee before he went to bed, who knows. But I think you would agree with me that his not being able to sleep was used in the providence of God, because what is going to happen here is going to end up causing Haman to lose his life and Mordecai's life to be saved, and ultimately the Jewish people to be saved. So this is to say that God really works in, as we say sometimes, God works in mysterious ways, and this is one of the mysterious ways of God, is God is definitely working to keep the king from being able to sleep and cause him to say, let's read the chronicles of the records of the kings and go back through the records and figure out what's going on here. So God is working in these little mysterious ways, and I think sometimes, in this age in which God is not working miraculously as he might have been in the book of Acts, his work is not so much on the surface, but it is more providential today. We shouldn't be so quick to discount the work of God, nor to discount little things that take place and say, well, maybe God is working through that insomnia or whatever it may be. And so here we come in verse 2, chapter 6. It was found written that Mordecai had told Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's chamberlains, the keepers of the door, who sought to lay hand on King Ahasuerus. That is, they wanted to kill him. You remember this from, I believe, chapter 2. Verse 3, it says, the king said, what honor and dignity had been done to Mordecai for this? And then said the king's servants that ministered unto him, there's nothing done for him. Now, just in case you forgot this, Mordecai heard that Bigthan and Teresh were going to assassinate the king, and he let the king know through Esther and saved the king's life. But clearly, nothing had ever been done. The king probably wiped his brow and said, "Ooh, that was a close one," and went on with business. And Mordecai was forgotten until this brought it back up again. Just imagine a little bit if you were Mordecai back then. I don't know how many months or years it had been, but when you save the life of the king, wouldn't you like at least a pat on the back, something, a visit to the Rose Garden, if you save the president's life, something that you ought to get, and yet he got nothing. You might even be tempted to say, hey, King, guess what? I saved your life. Can I get some bonbons or something? Some sort of thank you here for saving your life. And surely Mordecai was thinking, I can't believe he didn't even do anything for me. And surely even at some point he thought, I think I'll remind him of this. I'll get Esther to remind him. Somehow I'm going to remind the king. But it appears anyway that Mordecai just said, well, okay, I did my good deed. Nobody knows about it. I'm going to leave it. And had Mordecai pressed the issue back then God wouldn't have been able to use it here for one, or Mordecai would have missed out on the greater blessing. Sometimes it's best just to let your good deeds how do we say it? Speak for themselves, thank you. And move on, whether you get a great deal of credit for it or you don't get a great deal of credit for it. And in the end, maybe God will wake up the king and they'll read the records and say, hey, we should do something here. And it may be for such a time as this. Take the high road. That's the word. And so he took the high road here. And that, just interesting as you say, take the high road. He had enough humility not to insist that the king honor him, and yet he had enough, I'll say dignity, I don't know if that's the best word, not to bow down to Haman. So it seemed to be a pretty well-balanced man, that he was able to say, look, I'm not given on this issue, but over here, it's okay. I'll let that one go. Verse 4, the king said, who is in the court? Now Haman was come into the outward court of the king's house to speak unto the king to hang Mordecai on the gallows that he had prepared for him. These trains are coming quicker to this crash, aren't they? Whether now it's morning or whether Haman's coming in the middle of the night, which would sound doubtful, but here comes Haman, providentially so. So the king's servant said unto him, behold, Haman standeth in the court. And the king said, let him come in. So Haman came in, and the king said unto him, what shall be done to the man whom the king delighteth to honor? I love this part. Now Haman thought in his heart, to whom would the king delight to do more honor than to myself? Speaking of humility, he's thinking, no, I see what he's doing. He's asking me what I want. Yesterday he gave Esther half the kingdom if she wanted it, and now he's saying, I want to honor you. Of course, he didn't want to just come out and tell me this, so here it is. So a terrible lack of humility here. And verse 7, Haman answered the king, "For the man whom the king delighteth to honor, let the royal apparel be brought which the king useth to wear, and the horse which the king rideth upon, and the crown royal which is set upon his head." Before I forget, I'll just go ahead and say it right here. There's actually a little debate here on whether the crown goes on is going to go on the person or on the horse. Sounds very strange for us that you would put the king's crown on the horse. But there's actually some ancient artwork and a few things in ancient histories that do give us the idea in the picture that when the king wants to honor someone, he puts his crown on his horse, and then the honoree will ride on the horse. Again, sounds strange to us, but that's probably more what was in line here. Verse 9, "Let this apparel and horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, that they may array the man withal whom the king delighteth to honor, and bring him on horseback through the city, and proclaim before him, Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delighteth to honor." He's thinking, this would be a nice little parade for me, and surely the king will be willing to do this. And then, he's probably thinking in the back of his mind, then Mordecai will bow down to me, and I'll show him. This seems to be an ancient custom, if you will, because when the Pharaoh of Egypt chose Joseph to be the second in charge, it says he put on Joseph royal robes, put him in his chariot, paraded him through town, let everybody see that this is the guy. Mentioned getting an invitation to the queen. My guess is also that if the president offered you a ride on Air Force One, you would consider that an honor, and you would put it on Facebook. I'm on Air Force One. Here I am. Selfie. All that would be done there, and that would be the honor. So here's the equivalent, I guess. And in, where are we? Verse 10 of chapter 6. "Then the king said to Haman, Make haste and take the apparel, even the horse, as thou hast said, and do it even so to Mordecai the Jew, that sitteth at the king's gate. Let nothing fail of all that thou hast spoken." And all God's people said, don't you just love vindication when it comes and is at the hand of God? Something about this here in verse 10, he says, "Do this to Mordecai the Jew." Now, you say, isn't this the same guy that had given an edict to kill all the Jews, or to allow all the Jews to be killed? And he's saying, Mordecai the Jew, what's going on here? I think what's going on is when we get into chapter 7, you're going to see a little more. I think the king had been snookered on that whole thing. That's a Hebrew word, snookered. That what the king had been told, even if you go back in the text, what the king had been told is, there are some people who don't obey your laws. And they're not assimilated into the kingdom. They don't obey your laws. And we can't have, people around who are not law-abiding citizens. That was the line that was given. And the king didn't ask enough questions. He just said, oh, you're right. Let's do something about that and take care of them. And he didn't know it's the Jewish people and all that. There is a little bit of a danger. I'm going to say something and then unsay it. But there's a danger being the guy in the corner office, so to speak. You're the CEO, you're the guy on the top, you're the president or whatever, in that you can be insulated from some information that you needed to know. And you can get to that point where you just don't really know what's going on because you don't have the information that is coming to you, and it's not there. Now, the flip side where I want to undo that a little bit is that typically the guy in the corner office knows a lot more than you think he knows. And I see this as a pastor or as, in the past, for which I'm glad I'm not there anymore, but in the past I had about 75 or 80 employees, and so things happen with all the employees, and people always think the pastor doesn't know. And Very seldom was I ever surprised by anything. I knew, I just didn't want to do anything about it because I had other things to do and was carrying out. So you do get that information, but you can get to where you put such a shield around you, you don't know anything. I think this is probably where Ahasuerus is. And have you noticed, if you're the President of the United States and something comes up that is uncomely for the Republic, what does the President always claim? No knowledge. I don't know anything about it. My advisors didn't give me the information. How often is that true? I don't know. I've never been president. But that's certainly what they're going to claim. I think that really legitimately probably is the issue here. Otherwise, King Ahasuerus is just some sort of megalomaniac that is going to honor the guy he's about to kill. So here, he knows now he's a Jew. That has come forth earlier. And he says, honor the Jews. So verse 11 says, then took Haman the apparel and the horse and arrayed Mordecai and brought him on horseback through the street of the city and proclaimed before him, thus shall it be done unto the man whom the king delighteth to honor. And no doubt he did it with all his heart in it, right? Haman, as he's trying to, what do we say Sunday? Eat crow. Here he's got some crow pie coming right up. Verse 12. Mordecai came again to the king's gate, but Haman hastened to his house mourning and having his head covered. And Haman told Zeresh, his wife, and all of his friends everything that had befallen him. Then said his wise men and Zeresh his wife unto him, if Mordecai be of the seed of the Jews, before whom thou hast begun to fall, thou shalt not prevail against him, but shalt surely fall before him. I kind of wonder there where it says in the middle of that verse, then said his wise men and Zeresh his wife unto him. Why are they all of a sudden now wise? Because these are the same people who told him what to do. Have the gallows built, hang this man, and this Jew. And now he says, oh, if he's the seed of the Jews, you're going to fall before him. They gain a great deal of wisdom. I guess wisdom's a little easier after the fact, isn't it, when you know all the pieces of the puzzle. It says, and while they were yet talking with him, came the king's chamberlain and hasted to bring Haman into the banquet that Esther had prepared. So the king and Haman came to the banquet with Esther the queen, and the king said unto Esther on the second day at the banquet of wine, what is thy petition, Queen Esther? And it shall be granted thee, and what is thy request? It shall be performed, even to half the kingdom. Then Esther the queen announced and said, if I have found favor in thy sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we are sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be slain, to perish. But if we had been sold for bondmen and bondwomen, I would have held my tongue, although the enemy could not countervail the king's damage. Now, let me interpret that before you. It would be a dramatic moment in your movie on Esther, wouldn't it? As she comes and here now she is going to lay it out there. And she says, would you save my life? That's what I want. Forget half the kingdom. I want you to save my life and the life of my people, for we are sold. That, I think, is used, what would you say, symbolically, as we might even say, they sold me down the river. And this is what she's saying here. We've been sold to be destroyed, to be slain, to perish. And then she says, if we'd have just been sold into slavery, I wouldn't even have bothered you with it. That wouldn't be worth disturbing you over. But we haven't been sold into slavery. We've been sold to death. So verse 5, this is where I think that the king didn't know what was going on. Verse 5, it says, then the king Ahasuerus answered and said unto Esther the queen, who is he, and where is he that durst presume in his heart to do so? Seems like a guy surprised to me. What's up here? Who did this? And she comes right out. Esther said, the adversary and the enemy is this wicked Haman. And then Haman was afraid before the king and the queen. My guess is that's the greatest understatement of the Bible, perhaps, that the fear of God was set into him. And it says in verse 7, the king, arising from the banquet of wine, in his wrath went unto the palace garden, and Haman stood to make a request for his life to Esther the queen, for he saw that there was evil determined against him by the king. I might just add in verse 7, as well as a couple of places in verse 5, there's a place we're going to come back to before this series is over. And there are 4 places in the book of Esther where the name of God, Yahweh, is hidden within the Hebrew text. You can't see it in English, obviously, and you even have to look in Hebrew to find the YHWH, Yahweh. And when we get there, I don't want to make too much of it, but I am one who believes, of course, in verbal plenary inspiration, and that God chose each one of these words and that puts it together in such a way that there is dramatic I'll just say dramatic precision within the Word of God, and almost the fingerprint of God, where you say no man could have ever figured that out. You couldn't have done that. Now, let me just say, in case this scares you a little bit, I don't believe in what some have put out there called the Bible code. That if you take every 14th letter and add 21 to it, and color it purple, then you come up with the it says Donald Trump's going to be elected president. That's something you can do. There's only 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet, and how many in the English? 26. It would count as magical thinking. That's right. The truth is, everything that you and I have ever written, we wrote with 26 letters, right? So you can find a pattern. If you take any book, you can, with a computer, you can generate some sort of pattern to bring it out, because there's only 26 letters. 22 in the Hebrew makes it even a little bit easier statistically. So I discount all that. But this, I think, of the name of God hidden in a very specific pattern that we'll look at is somewhat interesting. But it's in verse 7 is the 4th one. And so verse 8, it says, then the king returned out of the palace garden into the palace of the banquet of wine. Once again, these descriptions here are what has been verified in archaeological discoveries. So he comes into the palace of the place of the banquet of wine, and Haman was fallen upon the bed where Esther was. Then said the king, will he force the queen also before me in the house? As the word went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Now, the every appearance here is that somehow Haman ends up falling down on the bed of Esther, and really, remember, Joseph got paraded around. Well, Joseph also got caught once in a situation that looked different than it was, and here's a situation that probably just looks different than it was. I doubt that in this little time Haman was up to anything. Who knows with Haman, but I doubt it. But that word fallen, it literally just means fallen, whether he was fallen in fear, whether he fell down begging, or whether God tripped him and he fell down just at the right point. It even enraged the heart of the king even more, so that he was so enraged. By verse 9 it says, then Harbona, one of the chamberlains, said before the king, behold also the gallows 50 cubits high, which Haman had made for Mordecai, who hath spoken a good thing for the king, standeth in the house of Haman. Then the king said, hang him. You feel good about that, don't you? Hang him thereon. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then was the king's wrath pacified. Talking about the height of those gallows, verse 9 almost sounds like Harbona comes out and says, look out the window over there. There at Haman's house. See that very tall gallows out there? He had that for Mordecai. And it's an instantaneous kind of thing. You wonder as well, if those gallows hadn't already been built, would the king have instantly gone towards this capital punishment? Or would he have said, put him in the dungeon, let me think about this for a while, let me figure out what I'm going to do with him, and maybe the whole thing dragged on, maybe later on the king said, well, you know, I guess it was all a big misunderstanding, whatever. But God worked it out behind the scenes in the providence, in his own providence, to have it handled right here. Well, next time we'll pick up in chapter 8, and we'll look over the remaining sessions in 8, 9, and 10, and then go back to the one session of the name of God hidden within. But we're out of time tonight. Thanks for being here. Let me lead us in a word of prayer.